Hello, this is Dr. Hausinger, and this brief PowerPoint presentation covers Chapter 3 in our Babor book, Drug Use in Global Perspective. So, as a precursor, the authors let us know that there are difficulties with this information for several reasons. One, there are inconsistencies in terms of tracking trends, and more industrialized nations yield more data. And then we have to figure out, like any good researcher, what are we measuring and how are we measuring it? Are we looking at occasional drug use? Are we looking at prolonged drug use? Are we looking at first-time experimentation? Are we looking at substances separately, individually? And self-reporting notoriously is biased, and so we can assume that a lot of things are underreported because people are afraid or have shame or guilt, etc. And then we have to look at our methodology. Exactly how are we gathering the data? And unless we're tracking, blood draws and system screens and hospitals and crimes and places where we can verify that somebody has actually had it in their system, it can be difficult to get the information if we're asking people to pardon the pun, narc on themselves in regards to their drug use. Okay. Right. So figure box 3.1 estimates the amount of illicit drug use in different countries. Inconsistent survey methods are used in different countries, and so the tools and instrumentation that we use are not necessarily unilateral. Right. And some countries yield more studies than others. Right. In your PowerPoint, in your module for this week, there's a PowerPoint by the UN regarding drug data, which is a very good in-depth look at the information that they have, and it was published in 2017. So please take a look at that as a supplement to this. Okay. So when we're looking at prevalence, we're looking at the estimated proportion of occasional drug users. Okay. Those who use illicit drugs are less likely to participate in general population surveys, and they might underreport. So it will bias our population. And the number of problem drug users in a population is calculated from various data sources, such as mortality statistics. So we're really getting a snapshot of the population there, rather than the prevalence or estimate of the prevalence, okay, if we're looking at lifetime use. Right. The United Nations, in a report from 2016, estimates that 250 million people between the ages of 15 and 64, which is 5% of the world's population, used an illicit drug in the year of 2014. Okay. And marijuana and other forms of cannabis it's the widely most used type of substance. Okay. Same age range, 15 to 64. So we see that 2.7 to 4.1% of all adults tried cannabis versus less than 1% of looking at other drugs. So that's quite significant. Okay. It's also important to note that the use of substances largely depends upon geography. And different countries and continents will have different use, largely because of geography, climate, and political control as well. So if we look at table 3.1, you see the annual prevalence of drug use in the percent of inhabitants, again, age 15 to 64. Okay. Cannabis scored pretty high, 7.5 in Africa. And then if we look at Asia, we have higher rates of other substances, and in the Americas, we have a higher rate of amphetamines and stimulants. So a good chart to check out. Okay. 1/2 of U.S. adults surveyed admitted to trying drugs in their lifetime. One of the things that we need to look at is the proximity to production. Okay. So a lot of the poppy fields are in Afghanistan, so we'll have higher rates there. And in the United States, too, we're going to see probably more methamphetamine in rural areas where there are more meth labs, as opposed to in the cities, we'll probably see more cocaine. cross-national comparisons are interesting to look at. Again, there are so many different factors that go into this. And again, please look at the drug report for 2019. It goes into some great detail. Okay, so looking at the distinction between problematic drug use and just drug use, okay, we see that we have a smaller part of the population that actually has problems with drugs and alcohol. Surveys from 6 different countries suggest that the proportion of the population who report ever having used an illicit drug, so that's 10 to 15% depending on the country, is 6 to 15 times higher than the proportion who report symptoms of current drug dependence. Of the 247 million people who report using drugs in the UN study, 29 million, which is 11.5%, had drug use disorders. So 29 million out of 247 million people. Okay. Right. Now, the heaviest users often account for most of the drug consumption. For an example, in a study about cocaine, a fifth of cocaine users consumed 70% of the produced cocaine. So again, we have a very small percent of the population, globally perhaps 10%, in the United States about 10%, that are consuming more of the substances than the sporadic users. Okay. When we look at problematic drug use, we want to review Chapter 2 and the material in 400 and regarding the routes of administration and risks. And IV use has a higher risk. One of the abbreviations that you're going to see is PWID, people who inject drugs. If you read UN reports or World Health Organization reports, you are going to see that. Now, polydrug use means consuming more than one drug in a setting. There was actually a polydrug dose diagnostic criteria. It was actually something that you could be diagnosed with, a polydrug user, in the DSM-4, and that was taken out of the DSM-5. It kind of meant that a person didn't necessarily have a particular drug of choice, and they used a lot of different substances. And we now evaluate all drugs individually on a scale, substance use disorder spectrum scale, from mild, moderate to severe. So a person might have mild alcohol use and a moderate amphetamine problem and a heavy cannabis problem or something like that. Okay. So examples of a polydrug use might be a speedball, which is using cocaine and heroin in the same syringe, or a goofball, which is using methamphetamine and heroin in the same syringe. Famously, there have been a lot of celebrities that have accidentally overdosed for taking a variety of prescription medication, most of it sedatives, benzodiazepines, painkillers, and mixing it with alcohol. So we have increased risk of overdose and accidental death when we mix substances. Okay. And there certainly are lethal drug combinations. Okay. Global trends in drug use do vary, but there are some things that we can track and see globally. So certainly in the United States and as well as other industrial nations, we see an increased amount in the non-medical use of psychopharma drugs. Okay. We've seen an increased abuse of cannabis, amphetamines, amphetamine-like substances, cocaine, and opiates in industrialized nations. Increased use in areas where there are political and social changes, opening and closing of borders. So being in Washington State, we're really close to Canada, we're fairly close to Mexico, we have the I-5 corridor, and we have a lot of ports, and we also are on the borders of several states, which makes us a fantastic hub for drug trafficking. Okay. So if you look at a lot of your port cities, you'll see a lot of things coming in because it's a port of trade, and drugs are absolutely no exception to that. Okay. Right. We see prevalence of drug use in young persons for several different factors. There's an inherent vulnerability there, and we see that cannabis is most frequently used. However, it's not necessarily, and when we're looking at this, we're not looking at it necessarily as an everyday use. It could be occasional use or sporadic use, but among youth, cannabis is most frequently used. There's a higher prevalence of inhalants, and the reason for that is that generally people can find these things in their garage. Some states have actually started regulating air dusters, like dust off and computer cleansers, that you have to be over 13 or have an ID to purchase that, because it was for a while there, it was something that was really being abused. You think about things like paint thinner, nail polish remover, whiteout, air conditioning liquid, gasoline, things that you would find in the garage are easily accessible and generally free. So you'd see higher rates of that. And not really well regulated as well. Anybody can buy paint. Okay. So it would make sense, especially if there aren't other materials around, that a person could turn to that. Okay. Rates of use vary globally, again, largely for geographic reasons. And there are age considerations to be made as well. So it varies with different types of drugs. We see that young adults generally have occasional use, and that problem use is really detected in young adults and middle age. However, there is an increased problem amongst the elderly with use, particularly prescription pills. There are individual trajectories and with drug use careers. The gateway hypothesis states that somebody is more likely to try a substance and then it lead to other substances, and that there's a predictable sequence of drug use. Well, what they found, and this is, of course, where cannabis is illicit, cannabis use is usually preceded by alcohol and nicotine use. Okay, so let me say that again. Cannabis use in adolescence is usually preceded by alcohol and nicotine use. So people are trying the legal drugs first. So we could look at nicotine and alcohol, or alcohol, nicotine to cannabis, and then stimulants. And the studies have shown that most cannabis users don't progress to the use of other drugs. Okay. Right. Hey. Natural use refers to the majority of people that do dabble with substances at an adolescent don't go on to have drug problems later on. You could think of it in terms of, if you will, a phase of one's life. But it is the smaller amount of the population that do start at that young age that develop problems later on. After the Vietnam War, people were very concerned that there was going to be an influx of soldiers that would come back and be addicted to heroin that had perhaps used when they were in Vietnam. And this is located on page 39. However, 76% of the people that admitted using heroin in Vietnam did not use when they came back. And those that continued to use heroin had deviant behavior and prior drug use before going to Vietnam. So when we look at that nature versus nurture again and environment, there are a lot of different things that we can look at. Okay. Right. Okay, so in summation, and again, please look at the PowerPoint for the drug report from 2017. It's going to give you much clearer information on exactly what is going on globally with drugs. In summation, the use of psychoactive substances is a global phenomenon, but available knowledge of the extent of the problem is based largely on evidence from higher income countries. The risk of drug initiation is highest in adolescence and among males, but gender differences in use are higher in low-income countries and for problem use than for any use. Most young people who experiment with drugs desist from drug use after some time, and the evidence is mixed on the likelihood that use of one drug, cannabis, leads to other drugs, heroin. Problem drug users tend to use more than one drug at a time, and in many instances, alcohol and tobacco are involved. And the reported rates of occasional problem drug use should be treated with caution because of inherent biases in population surveys of drug use estimation methods. So if you think about this, we don't often talk about drug use outside of the context of problems or addiction. It's just really not done. It's something that's perhaps is kind of quiet or kept in the shadows. We really only talk about drugs and alcohol when it gets to a problem level. So there's people that have a problem that don't, or have a problem that we know about. There's folks that use and don't have a problem, and there's people that don't use anything. So we're not talking about this whole middle class of people, which is the majority of drug users. And there's actually there is a drug users union actually that we'll be talking about a little bit later in the class, of people that want to bring drug use out of the shadows and say we are drug users, we don't necessarily have problems with drugs, which is quite interesting, and they have their own convention. So please think a little bit about that in terms of what you know about drugs and alcohol and problem use and non-problem use. I really look forward to hearing your feedback about the UN report.